So I asked the people in my Discord what they thought about the idea of making a game under a time limit, and they replied with this. And of course, I had to accept that challenge. So what I did was head straight into Unity. And the idea was to make a game in 10 minutes. So prior to this, I did some planning, some drafting, came up with some ideas, and we're off. So 10 minutes on the clock. First thing I wanted to do was to create a little bit of a shader. Basically, the idea of this game was to make a platformer similar to my Lego game, where the level sort of reveals itself as you play. So, go straight into it. I did practice making this shader in advance. I have made it before, so if you freak out that I'm doing a bit too quickly and making mistakes, don't worry. I was freaking out at the same time. So the idea is basically with the shader is that it calculates the distance to the player for each pixel, and then returns that as onto the sprite itself. So I'm using the universal render pipeline for this on Unity, which allows you to do 2D shaders, which is quite cool. So at this point, I am literally just taking the position. At position node, it takes the position on the pixel of each sprite. Calculate the distance. That's going to return me a huge value if it's very far away. And then I need some sort of range value, which says if it's beyond this range, then make it a different color. And that's easily done by just multiplying the two together. The one thing I don't like with Unity's shader editor is that it can get pretty messy pretty quickly. As you can see, I'm constantly having to move nodes around, for example, the end node, and just the interface is a bit awkward to deal with, but we move, it's okay. I then invert it with the 1- node, chuck that into a round function, which clamps it between 0 and 1 essentially, which is perfect for my needs, as I just chuck that straight into alpha, and now that should work. But a couple of things I want to add is the color of the sprite, so that, for example, I can make it whatever color I want, and the only thing getting modified is the alpha component, which is very handy. We didn't have to make this, obviously, that material from that shader. And there is one thing that we need to add with 2D sprite shaders, and that is a main texture. As you can see, a main texture property, just so it can take in the sprite. Didn't end up using it, but it's just something the sprite renderer requires to work. Not sure why, but that's okay. If that's what it wants, that's what it'll get. So that's the shaders editor right there. You can see how it works. That's my sprite there moving around, and by modifying the range, that black circle in the center gets bigger, smaller. I can modify the color however I want. It is perfect. The only thing we have to do in script is modify the player position property, which is super simple to do, and you'll see me doing that in just a sec. So then I wanted to just organize the hierarchy a bit. So create a new level. That's where all my platforms for the level are gonna go. So quite handy, keeping everything organized. And from there, it was time to get into the player controller. So making player controllers for platformer games is not very easy, because it has to be perfect, responsive, and fun to use. If it's not, then players just simply don't like it. But luckily for me, I've done it many times, so I just used a very simple method of doing platforming controllers, which was to just modify the velocity as is. And at this point, we saw that Unity was not loading at all. I faced many technical issues throughout the development of this, which was quite annoying considering we only had 10 minutes. And also considering that pretty much half that time had already passed and we didn't have a character controller yet. I was still trying my best to keep it under that limit. At this point, we're just getting the character and the levels ready with some physics, the colliders, the ground check methods, and all that, just to make sure that once we've written the code, we're already jumping around and everything inside the level, seeing as Visual Studio was still not loading in the background. And then here I am creating the player itself. There we go. To start off, just a basic prototype circle. This uses the same sprite material as the level, so that's, of course, this is always going to return black, the whole circle, because it's detecting the distance from itself. So that's quite handy. Don't even have to color that. Player controller added, and it's time to get coding. So obviously don't need these, that's pointless, and time to add some variables. Before we do that, just want to make sure that play is not rolling around in the world, so apply some constraints to the rigid body, create a physics 2D material just so our player is not stuck to the ground. So just reducing the friction there is something I found that every character I've had to do is just needs a physics material, otherwise it just doesn't work well. I'm not sure why. I wish there was a way to make that default. Maybe there is and I just don't know about it. But yeah, so this capsule collider here, that's just a trigger that's just going to detect when I'm on the ground or whatnot. And that's what I'm doing right now, just creating a new boolean just to detect. And this is the ground check method here on trigger enter. Very simple. Did this in the same 2D sandbox series for the character. Super simple way to do it. Fast, maybe not as efficient as a raycast, but for the purposes of this video, just to get it done, I think it did the trick very well. And the only thing I'm checking here is if the collider that we did touch is, if its parents, its root object, its name is level. Because if that's the case, that means it's part of the level, that means we can stand on it, that means we're on the ground. And then we have to do the same for when we leave the ground, so using on trigger exit. Copy paste that, and that was super simple already to do. And at this point we didn't have much time left, so I figured just get the character moving. Level design was going to take a while, I found, and in fact, I don't know if you can tell already, but we actually weren't able to finish the game under 10 minutes. 10 minutes being a very small amount of time, of course. I think minus some of the technical difficulties, it might have been possible to get something going, but it is of course very hard. So yeah, this ended up being about making a game in half an hour, in which case even then it was still quite tight because a lot of things needed to be modified, and at one point Unity crashed, so don't know why, but even on a 2D project, just for some reason Unity crashed when I was working on it, which was quite annoying. But yeah, so just creating some variables to manage the move speed. Setting the velocity directly is not a good idea for many character controllers. If you want some nice, smoother, more natural looking movement, I suggest not doing this. But for the sake of a platformer, I recommend doing this because it gives you more responsive, more adaptable movement, I guess is a good way to put it, because it's just so much easier to make the character move exactly how you want, since it's not affected by the physics of the game engine. I must admit, at this point, I was struggling to write fast and think of what I'm writing at the same time. So this method of taking the input is quite a basic method of doing it. As you can see, I'm using getAxis raw because that just makes it so that your response, your input is more responsive, and which for in the case of a platformer is exactly what you want. You want a very responsive character. Otherwise, players get annoyed, understandably. Unless the whole point of your character is to sort of be unresponsive, if that's the challenge of your game. For example, I believe Super Meat Boy or something, they use some sort of method like that, where your character is purposely unresponsive. I think it was that game, it might have been a different one, might be getting confused here. But yeah, so for the jump, the only thing I'm doing is saying if I press the button and I'm on the ground, then jump, otherwise don't jump, which is pretty much the most simple way of doing a jump method. It also gives pretty good results as well. So yeah, so this is the first test of the character controller, making sure that what we've written actually works. So fingers crossed at this point for sure. And yeah, so the first initial test was lacking, as you can see. But once we've modified some of the values in the rigid body, increased the gravity scale, which I believe is not a good way to do it from what I've heard, but if it works, it works, eh? So increase the jump speed, and that just gives you a faster jump and a faster fall. Bit too fast initially, but yeah, so just took some playing around with the values, and in fact playing around with the values took majority of the time up, trying to get it to look right. I think it was just a lack of testing beforehand which really did that. And as you can see, the movement on the x-axis is very sudden, which is good, but also very static, which I didn't quite like. I kind of wanted a bit more smoother, so I got rid of the get axis raw, which gives us a sort of smoother input and some smooth dampening on the ends of the movement, as you can see. But still not exactly what I wanted. I kind of did want the play to slide around a bit, considering it is a ball. It should look like it's rolling around. So yeah, look, again, playing with the values took such a long time out of the limit that we set, but it's okay. The end product was really well made, and I must admit, even after finishing this video, I ended up going back and finishing off the game just because I did enjoy making it. And I think there will be a demo at the end of this video, hopefully, showing off the final product of the game, which was not made in 10 minutes, but more made in 2 days, which is still pretty good considering the state of the game, I think. But yeah, so the plan is to release that, hopefully, see how it goes. Move speed is breaking. There was a lot of testing which I probably should have not done, going back and forth, which is sort of something that I've always done, considering haven't been making games on the time limits that long. But yeah, so using the method f.lerp function actually here, something to point out, it really does a good job of smoothing down your movement. You can easily adjust it how much you want to smooth it by using something like I've just written there, a smooth speed. Variable controls how much smoothing is done on the ends of the movement, and you'll see how that looks now. It looks much better, and although it's not as responsive, I think it provides a better, more natural movement for the player, which is exactly what we want. So yeah, as you can see, much better than just a ball suddenly stopping and starting. With that was pretty much the character controller done. It did need some modification later, but for the time being, I did want to move on to the camera, because the camera obviously at the moment is just standing still, which is not nice. So it's literally the exact same code as the camera control that we did in the 2D Sandbox series, literally just following the player, sorry, with a bit of delay. That's it. At this point as well, actually, what I'm doing now is setting that player position property in the material, in the shader. So if you haven't seen this before, basically you can set vectors, set floats, set anything inside the shader from script, which is quite handy, especially when creating stuff like this. I use the exact same method in the Lego game I made. And at this point I forgot what I called the player position inside its parameters. So as you can see, the reference there, underscore player underscore pos, that is how you can reference something from script. It's very similar to using an animation or animator. Pretty much the exact same, in fact. So with that done, you'll see that now the black area on the square, on the levels, they follow around where the player is, which is very nice. Gives it quite a nice looking effect. There you go. So perfect. So I found that the edges here were a bit too sharp. I kind of wanted to be a bit smoother, so I did change that later on in the shader itself. But the first thing I wanted to do was to get the camera working. So very quickly, already past our time limit, I got into coding the camera. So very similar to our player controller, some sort of smooth time value to determine how much to smooth the camera by, and we need a target transform to follow. This is literally just the position of the player, which we put in through the inspector. So this is the way you set a object's transform from my knowledge. I think they have changed it now, but I still use this method just because if it works, don't fix it. So basically what this does is it sets a position to the current position, a vector 3 position to the current position of the object, and then it says sets the object's position to that vector 3 position after it's been modified. So it's a bit redundant, I believe, but like I said, it works, and I've used this for as long as I can remember, and at that point I'm checking how long we've recorded for, and have realized that it's already been past the time limit. There we go, drag and drop the target transform as the player, and once you hit play here, you should see that the camera follows the player. At least the player should stay in the center of the screen as much as possible. There will be times when it is not, and that's good because that means the camera is delaying, which is very nice. So again, tweaking the values because I found that the range was a bit too small. We do want the player to reveal the level as they play, but we don't want them to struggle too much by not seeing anything. So by increasing that range, it's the perfect way to determine how much the player sees on the level. If you did want the code or the shader here that I've used, the link will be able to be downloaded on the Discord. So link to Discord will be in the description. There you go, very, very nice looking effect there. So like I said, I use this in the Lego game I made where the color is beyond, where the color of the object is set if it's close to the player. So at this point I got rid of the rounding function because I wanted that smooth transition from transparent to solid. Which looks much better, but obviously overlapping objects like that seem to pose an issue since we're playing with the alpha. I found that afterwards, after the video was recorded, that the better way to do this is to simply set the color either to white or black, which means that overlapping objects don't matter, which is very, very handy because especially in the later development of this game, it proved that you could do a lot more by having overlapping objects in your levels just to make them more interesting, really. So that's something about level design which you should definitely keep an eye out for. Layering things on creates a huge difference and a huge variety in a level. So as you can see, there's a bit of a odd issue happening on the player where this, even though it's a circle, it's coming up as if it's a kind of straight edged shape, which is not very nice. So I changed it to a square just to fix that for the purposes of the video. I ended up using a particle system for the player, which I really liked because it gave that sort of more dynamic view of the player rather than just being a static square in the level. Which, although it's alright for some games, it's not very interesting to play around with, whereas seeing particles fly off the player is always a nice way to give the player a bit more of an emotional response to the game, to make the game more satisfying to play. So doing some really basic level design here. Already realized that the time limit's way gone, so at this point I'm just taking my time, making sure that the game actually is decent enough to play. But of course, I'm trying to avoid overlapping objects, which made life really difficult because I had to make sure there was no seams, as well as there's no tiny overlaps between all these squares. And of course the levels here, just using geometric shapes because that's even easier. Otherwise, if I had to, I would have to make sprites in, say, Illustrator or Inkscape. If you don't know what Inkscape is, by the way, it's basically Same as Illustrator, but free. If you did want to check it out, link will be in the description for that as well. And here you go, very simple platformer set up. Obviously this material has not been set for them. So as soon as I did that, the game actually becomes a bit more difficult to play, you'll find, since you now don't see where you're jumping, which is perfect. That's exactly what we wanted for the game. A nice, very simple effect, just to make a game more interesting. Otherwise, making a 2D platformer is super simple. So that's what I recommend as well for all you guys trying to make really simple setup games out there. You want to create something that differentiates it from every other 2D platformer out there. Something different about it, something that makes it harder, something that makes it interesting. So at this point, I'm just setting up the particle system for the player to make it a little bit more interesting. So if you haven't used particles before in Unity, it's very simple to use. There is different plugins to do these now as well. I think there is actually Unity's own plugin or package that you can install via the package manager to make particles and visual effects much easier. I still like the legacy, old way of doing it, just because the way I've used for many years. And I think it provides a little bit more customizability compared to the new version. I don't think all the features are there for the new version just yet. As you can see, there's lots of values you can customize, and it is a bit overwhelming at first if you don't know what each of them does. So I highly recommend just chucking in a particle system, messing around with the values, see what they all do, just get familiar with it, because every game needs particles. And in fact, I used many different particles in the final product of this game. So as you can see already, just with a little bit of particles, they're not very well done at the moment. There is quite a lot of editing to do still. But even with just as is, it looks so much better to the player. I ended up getting rid of the cube, decided that the player should just be some particles. You still need the collider there, but you don't really need the sprite renderer. So if this is something you are interested in doing, give it a go. It might work for your game. I've done this before. It saves you from needing a character model, which is quite handy, of course. So definitely give it a go. It is quite interesting as well, but there is issues involved, since of course you can't see the player itself. You can only see the dust particles coming off it. So there is a lot of things you must fix up for that to work nicely. The method I did was to have two particle systems, one of them being in the local simulation space, so it's not affected by movement, whatnot, and the other one being in the global simulation space. So the one in the global one trails behind the player, and the other one, as you can see, just stays where the player is. Again, saves you from needing a player model or player sprite. Looks okay. I think I'd still prefer to use a player model or player sprite or anything, but judging by the time limit, of course, it's not very possible. Seeing as we're already 20 minutes in. So again, playing around with values, making it look as nice as possible. Again, there's so much you can customize with the particle system. I could make 10 videos on it and still wouldn't cover everything. So as you can see, we spent about the last 2-3 minutes working on the particle system for the player. Complete waste of time looking back now, because we could have easily moved on to the next part. But being a perfectionist, had to make it look perfect before we moved on. And that's something I recommend you guys don't do. And the way you can just practice really is the way to not do that. I think joining a game jam for me really helped me learn to not perfect everything and just get on with the development, because obviously you're under a time limit, you're under a strict time limit. While recording this, even although I set a time limit for myself, it's not like I was going to miss out on anything if I pass the time limit. Whereas with a game jam, you miss out on participating, which is a real shame, especially if you spent that long making a game and then you don't get to submit it because you ran out of time. So I think joining a game jam is something every game developer should do at least sometime in their life, maybe before they join the industry or even after. Doesn't matter really, just do it because it will help you learn that to not perfect everything, and learn to just say it's good enough, move on. So as you can see, the particles are a bit too thick for the player at the moment, but I spent so long working on it that I think I should move on, but still so much to do. We still need to create the rest of the levels. Still needed. I was considering adding some enemies and stuff, but I think writing the AI for that and designing them would have taken way too long. So I did skip out on enemies. I ended up just leaving it as a platformer, and this ended up being the final version of the player, just like this, which I think looked very nice. Kind of gives me some Geometry Dash sort of vibes, which is okay. Obviously, don't want to copy another player, and I think might have been able to do something a little bit better if I spent a little bit more time. But considering the time we spent on it already, I think it was okay. So the next bit, the other things we had to do, sorry for this, was to create the actual end of the game, as well as a way to kill the player and some collectibles, because jumping around in the level is not very fun. So as you can see, getting on with the collectibles. At this point, I wanted to create some collectibles, but I didn't know what to make them. So it wasn't until I started making them when I realized, hey, this could be a good idea. And the idea was to, as I was choosing a sprite, actually it came across me. Unity's, I think it's its own graphical user interface icon. It's like a picture of an eye almost, which is kind of weird. But considering the game was about not seeing much, the collectibles basically meant that what I could implement now was every time you collected an eye, you see more of the level. And what that meant was basically over time, I could reduce how much you see. And when you collect the eye, it resets how much you can see, which is a very nice way, I think, of encouraging the player to collect things, as well as a way to challenge the player, because over time they have to hurry up and find the next collectible. Similar to, let's say, the mobile game, that hill climb racing game, where you're constantly running out of petrol and you have to keep going and find the next petrol as fast as possible. So here you can see me trying to choose a material, trying to choose a sprite for it. And I settled on using the same sprite as the rest of the level, just so it doesn't pop out from everything else, and so it also gets revealed as you get closer to it. So at this point, I was looking on the internet to see for some inspiration. That's literally all it was, because I had no idea still at this point what I wanted my collectibles to be. So I went on Google Images, probably the best way to get inspiration, and just typed in collectibles in games. And then here you go. So this is where I'm looking through all the sprites I have at my disposal that I can use. And I was just looking through all of them until I came across the eyes. And that was the one I decided to use, because that's when I got the idea of what I wanted the collectibles to be. Of course, our shader doesn't actually account for using that texture 2D. So as you can see, once you've set the texture up, a sprite, it goes straight to your shader. And if you haven't set that up in your shader graph itself, then it's not going to be visible. It's just going to stay as a black square, as you can see here. So I went straight to the shader editor again to modify that. And the way you do that, you just drag in the texture 2D. Of course, you have to sample it. So there is a sampling node for that. And from there, the only value we really need is the alpha, because the rest of the texture is visible. So alpha is the transparency value of each pixel in the texture. So if it's white, then it's visible. If it's black, then it's invisible. And by multiplying them together, that gives you the exact value you need. So alpha, if it's white, that means the value is 1. If it's black, that means it's 0. So basically, the black areas are going to be 0. So anything multiplied by 0, of course, is 0, as you know. And basically, as you can see, it works very nicely. but now we had to give it a script so that is actually collectible in the game. And that's what I moved on to doing next. As soon as I set up some of the collisions and stuff for these objects, if you are adding collectibles in your games, definitely make them a prefab so that you can just drag and drop them from your asset window whenever you want. But of course, once you've set the prefab up, you have to make sure you keep overriding it and updating if you do change any of its values, just so they all stay the same. Or even better, just modify the prefab instead. So as you can see, I've created the range property as well in the inspector, just so that can be modified via code. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. In the update function, I'm just going to make it so that the range over time, every frame, it gets reduced by a very small amount. So at this point, I'm writing the code for the collectible. So same way that you check the trigger for touching the level, we're just checking if the parent's name is collectible. So if it's under that folder, then just delete the object that we collide with. And this is where you would say, for example, as well, +1 to your score or anything else like that. So in my case, I'm saying range +1, which means I see well, it should be I see more, but you'll see that range +1 actually makes it so that I see less. And that's because we actually forgot to invert the range value in our shader editor, which it was a big mistake because it made development slightly harder as everything was essentially backwards, which is not very easy to deal with, especially under a time limit. That said, the time limit is pretty much out the window at this point. And there you go, you'll see that I collected it and the range that we see was reduced. But all you have to do was just invert that from plus equals to minus equals, except that didn't hit me at the time. I was trying to modify different values. And yeah, so like I said, definitely make sure one of the steps I skipped was planning. The more you plan, the easier development gets and the quicker it actually goes, because you see exactly what you want your game to be, how you want to achieve it, and all of that, how you want your collectibles to work, what you want them to do. And for example, your shaders, plan them, test them, make sure it all works, prototyping, all that. Otherwise, you'll come across a lot of issues throughout development. So as you can see, the collectibles are working, but I didn't really like how they reveal so much of the level. So I did reduce that value quite a bit, except that value was hard-coded. I should have made it a variable as well, looking back now. But hey, there's always something you can improve as well, to be fair. Apart from that, I was quite happy with the direction the game was heading. I think it was just a bit slow, but that's because, like I said, planning should have been done better. Getting the foundation correct and all that. So as you can see here, I wrote this bit backwards as well. That should have been plus 0.1. And then here I'm creating that value, which I did correctly, made it a variable. And basically what this does is it slowly fades away the ranges which you can see. Again, like I wrote backwards, so it's going to actually make it grow so we see more over time, which is not very nice. There you go, and instantly it just grew because I didn't set the values very nicely. But with that modified, it actually worked pretty well, slowly fading over time, and then as you collect the eyes, it adds so you can see more. There you go, except it was fading a bit fast, but I think the faster you make it fade, the more challenging it is for the player. So in fact, I did consider making this a separate setting in the game for the player themselves to manage, or maybe even like a difficulty setting. So the harder the game is, the faster it fades, the less that the eyes re-give vision back, I guess. But yeah. So moving on, I did do some level design. At this point, I was creating the end screen. So as you can see, canvas, always scale with screen size for canvases and make it 0.5. That means that regardless of what size your screen is, it's pretty much looks the same on every device. Unless you're having a very weird aspect ratio from, for example, laptop to mobile phone, or computer to mobile phone, where it's going from landscape to portrait. That poses a bit of a challenge. Still, it looks better than if you were to make it constant pixel size or anything like that. That's just something I discovered over time through my own testing. I'm not sure if that's how you're meant to do it, but it's what's proven to work for me every single time. I'd still recommend checking out Unity's tutorials on UI. If they have anything, I'll have a look, and if I find anything useful, I'll chuck it in the description. Apart from that, Brackeys is always a good source. I'll have a link to their channel in the description as well. Unfortunately, they have stopped uploading, which was quite disappointing to hear. But I'll find all the resources I can and chuck them in the description for you guys if you are interested in making a game like this. That said, this game is going to be released. So as you can see here, I was messing around with my computer a bit because it started to lag quite a lot. So as soon as I fixed that, straight back into Unity and moved on to creating the animations, because I kind of wanted the death screen to fade in after you die. So the animations for UI is always a very easy way to make UI look more interesting. Having things fade in, fade out, move around. Panels I've used a lot, so that panel is basically just going to fade away the game scene, as if, well, make it look like it fades away. In reality, it's just overlaying. That's literally it. And then, yeah, so that as soon as that fades in after the player's dead, it creates a nice sort of death effect. More interesting than it would be to just reset the level, or to simply, say game over, end the game. So obviously, it depends on the style of your game. If your game, for example, is, a speed run type of game, you'd want to display different things on the screen. That said, this game could be a speed run type of game by recording how long it takes the player to complete the level. If you really, really wanted to, you could. But at this point, I was not interested in doing that. I just wanted to get the game done. It was already about 40 minutes into development. So half an hour's out the window too now. But I think at this point, I was just kind of enjoying making a game. So we'll change the title here to making a game in 1 hour. But so at this point, I finished the animation. I set that all up. And unfortunately, Unity did actually crash at this point of the video. And I couldn't find any more footage of the game, of making the game. So unfortunately, that is it for today's episode. So like I said, I did end the game there. The end screen was working perfectly, and all that. The levels were finished. That was all done. The game got done within the hour, so hooray. So that was good. Objective complete. Obviously not 10 minutes, so Sorry about that. But yeah, so in the end, became a pretty fun game. There is gonna be video footage of the game on screen now. Again, keep up to all this on the Discord. So much to do there. Building a great community. And yeah, so thanks for watching, guys. That was today's video. Let's make a game in 1 hour. And yeah, thanks for all the support and everything. Subscribe, like if you haven't already. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.